Hello everyone, welcome. My name's James Harding. I'm editor and co-founder of Tortoise, and I'm extremely excited about this evening's ThinkIn. As you know, a ThinkIn is an open news meeting, and it's an attempt to try to draw on as much wisdom as we have between us. So it's not like a Q&A, it's not a panel discussion. One of the things that the pandemic has done is get rid of those for a while. But what we do want to do is keep the spirit of our open news meeting, to try to hear from as many people as possible. And in tonight's endeavour, what we're trying to do is think beyond the lockdown, think about how we're going to live next, how we're going to see or potentially encourage the redesign of our working lives, of the system of capitalism, of the marketplace. We've given it the rather uplifting title of, can this pandemic breed game-changing ideas? Is it going to be a spur to innovation? And we have with us two people who each in their own ways have lived at the very heart of the system of our marketplace. Paul Polman made purpose and thinking about social outcomes fashionable long before it was fashionable in business. He was the chief executive, as many of you will know, of Unilever, but has now set up a new venture called Invention, which is doing exactly that, rethinking the way in which business works, particularly those businesses that touch so many of our lives. And Jeff Lynn is someone who brings people into the marketplace. He runs Seedrs, the founder of Seedrs, which is one of those organizations that enables you to invest in new and dynamic startups. But the most important thing in a ThinkIn, as ever, is actually you, the experience, expertise, point of view you bring to it. As you know, we have this loosely enforced rule, which is no questions. We want to hear what you think. And if you want to say something, it's really simple. My colleague and fellow editor, Liz Mosley, is running the chat, by which that means she's moderating, cajoling, encouraging you to weigh in with your thoughts. And, you know, we've got hundreds of people on as ever this evening. And if you hit that participants tab, you'll see that you can raise a little blue digital hand. And the little blue digital hand is a way of saying, hello, I'm here, I've got something to say. And I'm just going to encourage you, before I come to Paul and start thinking about this in some detail, I'm just going to encourage you to press that participants tab and if you like, answer the question, answer a fundamental question, which is whether you think that, and I'm talking specifically about our system of capitalism, not online retail or, you know, specific business models, but the system of capitalism itself. Do we think there is going to be crisis innovation? Do we think the pandemic is going to breed game-changing ideas? If you're someone who thinks the answer to that question is yes, would you just raise your blue hand, press the thing that says raise hand, and I just want to see how many people, broadly as we kick off, think it is going to result in something that is a fundamental change, a systemic change. I'm particularly happy to see that actually both Jeff and Paul think it is, so that's encouraging. Otherwise, this could be quite a dead end pretty quickly. Look, the numbers are interesting. I think you would say sort of 60%, you know, probably around 60%, but it's certainly not a vast majority. So Paul, why don't I start by coming to you? You'll do a better job of explaining the ambition of Imagine and how it can make for a more sustainable set of businesses. But can you just do that in the context of what you think the macro environment is? Because I think there's a risk to this conversation that we are a little bit Pollyanna-ish. We're looking at the blue skies of the future when, frankly, we're headed into a very, very serious winter.
Yeah, well, thank you, James, and also Jeff, for this opportunity. And first of all, James, your question is a little bit binary, yes or no. And getting 60% to be positive is actually not so bad, because it has a lot of ifs and buts, and it's not a given. Yeah. We failed at previous occasions, and I hope that we will rise to the opportunity. The reason I raised my hand is that we have it within our own means to decide that future that we want to have, and we can decide to be fatalists and pay an even dearer price than the corona crisis, or all get together and put our best knowledge, willpower, tools, means, and create that future that we all want, as so well embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's why I'm pleased to see the 60%. We created Imagine very simply because we saw that although a great majority of people actually want this world to be functioning better, for more people attacking the issues of climate change, inequality, the limits of planetary boundaries are showing up. And broadly, you find a big enough group of CEOs that say we want to change. And so is the same would be true at governmental level. But collectively, we're not arriving there. We're not able to actually muster that change at speed and scale. I think broadly, although there are some skeptics and cynics out there, which we to some extent respect, but broadly, I think people have understood what needs to be done around the burning issues, especially of climate change and inequality. So Imagine starts from a very simple premise that we focus on accelerating the solutions towards climate change and inequality. We do that by leveraging the private sector. I'll get back to that. And the way we do that is at CEO level, we bring a critical mass of CEOs together across the value chain. And that is very important to us. And when you have a critical mass of CEOs together across the value chain, they actually become more courageous by the sheer fact that they are together. And actually you achieve the ability to achieve some tipping points. And then,
Paul, sorry, can I just interrupt for one second?
No problem.
When you talk about the value chain, forgive me, I'm not sure I entirely understand what that means. Is that like a supply chain for one line of business?
Absolutely. So it's better to do it by industry so that you get a little bit of a race to the top. That's what we like, and build on that inherent competitiveness that is there. So for example, James, we brought the fashion industry together, 66 companies now, representing about 30% of the fashion. That means even the growers of cotton, to the supply chain where the production is taking place, to the brands itself. And together, we are actually able to achieve more than each of the individual CEOs can do. For example, enormous pressure in society to get out of plastics. We all know the issues of plastics in the ocean. Enormous pressure on society to get to more sustainable agriculture. Fashion has cotton. So unsustainable cotton production is still a norm more than anything else. Putting the industry together at critical mass, these CEOs can actually achieve more. For example, you can, with 30% of the market, actually move a market to regenerative cotton. Collectively, you can figure out what collection systems are for plastics. And what we then do is, recognizing that there is only a limited legitimacy to the CEOs alone, is with that critical mass, we help de-risk the governmental process. We go to governments and say, look at this big group of responsible businesses that actually want to improve, help us put the frameworks, the rules, the laws, the regulations in place to get there.
Well, and Paul, it's really great to hear those examples. And actually, I'd love in the course of the hour that we've got together to hear more of those in detail. I see that actually one of the people on the chat is already talking about practical example of introducing donut economics, and I'd love to hear from Marie-Claire on that in a moment. But just stand back, if you would. We had David Miliband on last night. He was talking about the situation for the International Rescue Committee, but he was also raising a concern that he has about, if you like, government bandwidth, leadership bandwidth. And on the two big issues you raised, climate change and inequality, his concern was, and this was particularly true around climate, that actually what we are discovering is that the economy is going to be so troubled that there is going to be an overwhelming urge to try and get people back to work. And in terms of public policy, governments are really going to be focused on the global health agenda. And actually that might suck up quite a lot of the energy that might otherwise have gone to sustainability and climate.
Yeah, there are some factors that play in here, and actually more so than he was alluding to yesterday night. I'm sorry I couldn't listen into that. But what you really see is we have discovered again once more during this global crisis that we have an issue of global governance. The first reaction when it got to attacking the pandemic was to go back to your national boundaries or borders, to put export restrictions in place on medical equipment, to put export restrictions in place on food now, the second round, and to see actually governments not cooperating or working together, but putting an enormous pressure on the private sector to fulfill their immediate short-term needs. And as a result, especially in Europe and the US, we were out of the starting blocks broadly a little bit slower than we should have, with the exception of the Nordic countries and Germany. The thing that has happened, what we are suffering from, is that most of the institutions that we deal with right now have been designed in 1944 at the time of Bretton Woods. Anybody who runs a company will have already 10 or 15 times had a strategy change or a change in the structure to cheerily survive. Here the world has moved on, but our global governance system that was designed when 85% of our economy was in Western Europe and the US has stood still. And these institutions are falling short, be it the WTO, be it the UN to some extent, be it the IMF or the World Bank. And that is haunting us. And when you get a crisis like this, unfortunately, you see the cracks even widening. At the financial crisis 10 years ago, we had the G20 at least get together and put a joint stimulus package in place. But then the follow-up and the actions to get that trickle through to the real economy and make it more equitable and address some of these burning issues, like the planetary boundaries and climate change especially, were not really taken care of and looked after. And here again, we pay the price for that. You could say that the coronavirus is a result of this challenge with the planetary boundaries. 75% of the pandemics that we have are originating in animals because of the encroachment that we have on their nature and their habitat. You see the effects of climate change coming in terms of poverty. And again, with the coronavirus, we have discovered that it is especially the poor that pay the higher price. So I agree with David when he said yesterday that the initial reaction when, paradigm changes rarely happen when there is an emergency. People are talking, and some politicians are talking about, let's go back to where we came from. Let's create what we had because it was better. Let's restart the economy. And that is a missed opportunity. We're putting in $10 trillion plus now to get the economies stabilized. This is just to stabilize the economy. And soon we will discover that the unemployment levels have gone up to 15, 20% in many countries. Whilst the coronavirus kills old people, the pandemic and the economic consequences are going to kill the young people because there's a lot of social cohesion at risk. And the big risk is if the governments don't address that immediately, would be lack of social cohesion, would be further populism, would be further extremes in the polls, and it might go back to the situations that we've seen in the 20s or the 30s. So the politicians will say, give me jobs right away. Do the quick things that give me the results in the next 3 or 6 months. So we understand that pressure. But I don't think in many of these cases, we have to make a compromise.
So Paul, there's so much there, and unfortunately we have time, and so what I'd really love to do is just try and take some of those things one thing at a time. And as you're talking, it's really striking that you're already beginning to see people asking about systemic changes. So there's a strand of debate around growth itself, right? How much is growth the enemy? Do we think we need to move to a lower growth, no growth model? That's one of the questions. And then the other one is actually directly about incentives and particularly the past life, your past life, I suppose, running really large multinational companies and CEO pay. So how do you align the pay and the expectations of shareholders with what you're talking about here, which is public outcomes? And that seems to me to be, when you talk about moving away from a restart to something more like a redesign, that seems to me elemental to that. So how do you...
absolutely. And the financial market, as you rightfully allude to in the second part of your question, will play an incredible role in that. Otherwise, we won't get there. If we don't, again, help transform the financial system and make it subservient to the real economy versus the other way around, we won't get there. So many people, fortunately also in the financial market, are advocating for quite some drastic changes that I hope we can accelerate with this move. To be concrete around that is, much of the money that is invested in the financial markets are institutional investors, which are basically your or my pension funds. And they not only want a return in 15, 20 or 30 years when you are going to retire, but they also want to make sure that those people that retire can retire in a world that they can live in. That is equally important. And not surprisingly now, you see people like the Larry Finks or the major asset owners or the asset managers calling for a model that is actually much more multi-stakeholder. That was the statement of the BRT in the US That
Yeah.
was the WEF theme of this year. And you see these requests for more purpose-driven business models coming up to the service 10 times more as a result of this COVID crisis.
And tell us honestly though, Paul, because you've been in there, right? You've run a very large company, and the truth is you were making those points, those speeches about purpose, about climate, about inequality, but the truth is you were also having to deal with the investor meetings, the scrutiny of your
Absolutely.
return on investment. And do you come away from all of that thinking, and particularly looking ahead at the economy we're facing, that there needs to be a rewriting of the rules for CEOs on their performance? Because in the end, it must be the case shareholders are overwhelmingly looking at your financial performance, not your overall social impact.
Well, unfortunately, we haven't given them the tools to properly assess the other things. When I was born, more or less, James, 80–90% of a company's balance sheet was also reflect its real value in the market. And that's what really our current accounting system is based on. And that was a very narrow definition. Then we got into the service economies. We got into many more intangibles driving the value of companies. And we've just been arrogantly lazy to put a value on that. We don't put a value on human rights in your value chain, on having engagement or the right culture with your employees. But increasingly, we can measure that. When I started about 10, 12 years ago in Unilever putting this model out there, I had a lot of skeptics, and it probably was a little bit more difficult to convince the financial market. But frankly, a lot has changed. We now have clear data over the last 5 years that companies that are run for their multiple stakeholders, with what you call an environmental, social, and governance point of view, tend to perform better. We also have technology that has developed at a faster speed than we saw. This is Moore's law on steroids as it comes to the decrease in the price of green energy that we've seen. In 80% of the world now, solar or wind would be cheaper than fossil, and it's already cheaper everywhere than coal. So technology has developed. And then the third element I would say is that the citizens of this world are more demanding than they were 10 years ago, because they simply have enough from paying the price of our irresponsibility in our behavior. If the crisis already 10 years ago showed us one thing, was that banks were too big to fail, but people were too small to matter. So CEO compensation and incentive systems that you keep alluding to might be a part, but I don't think that's the key part. That's not putting your finger on the most important thing. Sure, I wish that some of these CEO compensations are not directly linked to the share price, so that we don't get dysfunctional behavior of share buybacks or special dividends or short-term behavior of the CEOs, which undoubtedly exist. But increasingly, there is a bigger group of CEOs out there that understands that they ultimately will be judged by the contributions they make to society and not to their own bank accounts.
So Paul, I'm going to come back to that, and I'd like to bring Jeff Lynn in a moment, but a number of people have just raised points, and I want to see if we could to bring some of them in. For a start, Marie-Claire, you made a point right at the outset about low growth donut economics. Hello there. Do you want to just, for those of us, I think I'm just at the point where I could nearly pretend to know what that is, but why don't you save me the embarrassment and explain how it would work?
To be honest, I don't know a great deal about it. I mean, I've read quite a bit about it, but in effect, if you think about the donut and you think about the center being the hole into which social systems will fall, so you want to minimize that. And then on the outside, you have the ecological systems and so on, and you don't want to encroach on those. So the ideal is this donut, this ring. And I think the main point about it is about thriving versus growth at all costs. So it's not about not having any growth, but it's about having growth without the cost.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's really interesting. I'm going to just pull a few points in in a run and then see, because Anita Bagley, I'd also like to pick up on the point that Anita's made. Anita, we were talking. Hello there.
Hello.
I'm really struck by the fact that, Paul's talking about getting businesses to make change that create the models for how governments react. And last night, David Miliband was saying the same thing. You need business and NGO innovation that sometimes preempts government innovation. I know there's a lot of skepticism around what businesses can do, but I just was interested to know what you thought, given what you'd said in the in text.
Yes, no, thank you. I mean, I just thought it was very interesting. As you say, I joined the Tony Blair ThinkIn last week and David's last night, and it's a pleasure. Thank you, Paul, for your time. But just the point that Paul was making, you know, it's very interesting, as Tony said a similar thing in terms of his points of action, of bringing industry leading CEOs to work alongside, you know, cabinet ministers to really try and solve some of these issues. And I think just the thought about bringing, you know, the best minds we can together is you know, a fantastic idea, and certainly you know, something that Tony mentioned as well. And I just thought it was interesting that Paul, you know, and the business that he has at Imagine is really focused on doing that and just bringing the, you know, the kind of best brains together to find solutions and push initiatives forward.
It's interesting. I mean, for what it's worth, after the ThinkIn last night with David Miliband, one of the conversations we had, I called him afterwards and said, thanks very much. And we talked a little bit about the strange failure of the G7 and the G20 to convene, and who in the space that's left by those could convene, who could bring the Bill Gateses or the, you know, world of Silicon Valley, all of those people, some Bill and Melinda, I should say, you know. So Paul, can I just sort of go back to you on that and pick up on Anita's point? In the world that you see now, and you know, you touched on COP in particular, or the climate issue in particular, how worried are you that we are going to retreat into a world of much greater nationalism or regionalism, and the, if you like, the sort of organizing idea of Imagine, which is to think about how global supply chains could work to have a beneficial impact on global problems, is actually not really going to be feasible?
Well, there are several things in your question that we need to unpick a little bit. Supply chain, the climate change, the role of business in this. So let's take them one by one for a second very quickly. On climate change, I want to go back to Paris in 2015. We would not have had the climate change agreement if the citizens of this world would have not walked the streets, and if business at large would not have been present and say we want to change. It is interesting now that despite the situation that we find ourselves in, we unfortunately have a government in the US that puts in extra subsidies for the fossil fuel industries, but there are companies here like Shell and others that want to accelerate towards the green path, because they know it's better jobs, it's more secure jobs, and it is a world that everybody can live in. So we see this dichotomy right now between some governments, the Bolsonaros, the Obradors in Mexico, the Putins, the Erdogans, and the Trumps. But then we see an alignment under that from most other countries in the world. Did you know that over 100 countries are aligned and have signed up already to a glide path in line with the Paris agreements? But we don't hear from them because 60 of them are drowning small island states. So, but they are countries and they're people and they count. So a lot of it will depend, first of all, on the elections in November, I hate to say, in the direction global governance will be going. We have a Europe that is very preoccupied with themselves, cannot come to an agreement between themselves, and have a big choice to make between unilateralism and actually breaking up Europe. And then we have within that the UK factor that obviously will absorb some time if we like it or not. We have a US that has chosen, at the moment at least, for unilateralism. And we see that everywhere, even in the yesterday's pledges to develop a vaccine. They did not want to participate in the 8 billion pledge, but it runs much deeper than that. And a China that is a little hesitant. A China that is getting much more involved in the developing markets with their Belt and Road Initiative, also willing to set some standards and other things out there, but not participating yet in this global governance. But what do you see? Again, in the US, there is a big movement, the America Pledge, or the We Are Still In movement, which basically represents about 70% of the US GDP, where companies, where local cities, local governments say, hey, we have Washington here, but we have the real people here. And that is a much more important indicator that we're moving in the right direction. It won't be easy. We won't go as fast as we should be going, but it's much more. On the supply chain, in 2 seconds, it is not that supply chains were broken. It is that countries, first and foremost, were mismanaging the peak of the coronavirus and got an enormous pressure in their health system that no supply chain is designed for, not the ones in the future either. So let's not mix up political incompetence with supply chains. I would argue that the people that were managing the supply chains, despite the risk of coronavirus, did an enormous job beyond the call of duty to get the products to all of us, and that we've only seen a limited amount of disruption despite all of this. Now, there are some supply chains that will change. The medical supply chain undoubtedly will change because politicians are scared. But then there are other supply chains, let's say related to services and technology, or some of the other products that we simply cannot make local, where we might bring in more agility, where we might bring in more flexibility, where we might go out of the concept of just in time. I understand all of that, but basically the benefits of a global supply chain far outweigh the disadvantages. What we do need to do is to be sure that if we globalize, that we also take care of the people that suffer from the globalization. And that gets us back to the inequality that I talked about before.
Well, we're going to come to that because I saw in the chat Mark Sainsbury made an interesting point, or actually really sort of tested the idea of the extent to which investments, future funding should be linked to green criteria and government bailouts too. And I want to come to that in a second. I'm going to come to him, and I saw Michael Greenad's hand up. I'm going to bring them in. But Jeff Lynn, I just wanted to read you an absolutely just sort of, I think, completely on it note in the chat. I don't know whether you've seen it, but David Rose has written saying, you know, there have been some terrific people here, etc., an amazing group, etc. But, and here's what they said. They said here, and so many people seem to reference a new settlement and capitalism working for the many, etc., and fairness. But we then all end up circling back to pragmatic economics, despite the idealism in the face of populism and autocracy, a sort of Macron-esque with some Jacinda Ardern thrown in. He says, I agree with it as a third wayer and one-time local politician, but it's interesting to watch people flirt with a move to the left, acknowledge it, and then wisely revert back to the centre. Incrementalism still holds sway, question mark. And I just thought, Jeff, if I could play you in, you know, you've got a sort of very different lens on this and a different responsibility, which is around, you know, the many people making investments in new kinds of business and the value of business itself succeeding. So how much do you think that the idealism, the idea of a redesign of the economy is the kind of thing we think about when we're in lockdown, and when the world returns, we're just going to go back to it and incrementalism will still hold sway?
Well, look, James, it's a great question. It's a great quote from a comment from David Rose, and I guess my overarching answer to that is that I don't necessarily see a conflict, or I don't think there has to be a conflict between pragmatic economics and idealism. I mean, you know, it's interesting. I mean, it's an honor to be here, an honor to be talking on Paul. Paul and I probably represent the furthest extremes in terms of company size represented. You know, I chair a 100-person company working with 2-person companies, you know, versus Unilever. So not, you know, I come to many of the exact same places that Paul does, although I probably come to it from a slightly different angle, which is, you know, I see day in and day out the huge creativity and power of entrepreneurs to develop solutions to the problems of our day, including climate change. And I see investors, and what's really interesting on a platform like ours is most people who are investing through us are doing so off of their own balance sheets. They're not running money for other people. We have some institutional investors, but for the most part, it's people who are investing their own money, or their family's money, and therefore they can decide where they want it to go. And we see the decisions that they're making in terms of what sorts of entrepreneurs they want to back. And without purporting to be able to get into anywhere near the level of detail that many of the great commentators have, or Paul has, around many of the specific issues around climate change and inequality, one of the things that has heartened me and has probably reinforced my view through, you know, that pragmatic economics and idealism, you know, aren't necessarily in conflict, is the extent to which we have seen the growing popularity of sustainable businesses on our platform. When we launched in 2012, that wasn't really a sector, and there was always a feeling that people who were launching sustainable businesses were doing so in some sort of social enterprise, quasi-charitable way, and that it wasn't necessarily an investment opportunity. That paradigm has gotten completely thrown out the window, and what we now see see is so many investors coming to us to back businesses that are trying to solve problems of climate, that are trying to solve problems of poverty, they're trying to solve many other problems, doing so in a for-profit, but socially conscious way. And that's where investors' money wants to go. So I'm, the examples are too many to go into. And as I say, I don't even, I'm certainly not equipped to talk about, many of the specific issues in nearly as much detail as many people on this call are. But I think at a high level, I come back to this point that, if we have the right structures in place, if we have the ability for money to find, to be allocated to not just its most productive means, but its best means, and we're able to define what we think best is, I think there's a way within the broad capitalist, whatever you want to call it, economic framework. I mean, I call myself a capitalist. I don't think that's a bad term. I don't believe necessarily in that the change that we want to see, the change that we want to affect, is coupled with an abandonment of capitalism. But within the capitalist, within a capitalist framework, there are so many ways. Some obviously need to be driven by regulation, but so many that can be driven by the market, that can be driven by creative entrepreneurs and investors to achieve the kind of ideals that we're trying to achieve here.
And Jeff, I'm going to come back because there's a risk that, not for the first time in ThinkIn, that we have a really interesting conversation that doesn't get close to answering the question. But one of the ones that I want to do is to try and drill into innovation itself, and whether or not actually in moments like this we do see innovation, or whether or not the environment for it is closed. But I do want to just make sure we followed through on the idea that Paul was talking about the sort of, if you like, the T's and C's, the terms and conditions of the economy that comes out of this. And Mark Sainsbury, I don't know whether you're there, but Mark was making a point about what are the conditions that should be attached to government bailouts, to government funding. Yeah. Hello, Mark. Do you want to sort of, I imagine it's a point more than anything, but sort of put it, play it in.
Well, yeah, I've spent this morning actually discussing the angle of, how to galvanize public kind of conversations around this, such that the governments have the kind of political headroom to embolden them to really insist on the right conditions behind their capital injections. There seems to be a unique moment in time where actually, governments can can insist on corporate behaviours and practices that they've never been able to influence previously. But I haven't got the answers. I'm interested in Paul's.
Paul, what do you think?
No, it's there's a few things. The first thing is the main risk that we now have is we are now in the stabilizing phase, where governments in the world are pumping in nearly mindlessly enormous amounts of money to avoid bigger disasters, but not really with a view of the future. And to some extent, they've stabilized that. And in the US, you can see that in the stock market. But not much thinking has gone into it other than keeping people alive. So providing loans to small businesses, providing social safety nets for several weeks or months to people. The big risk now is that we discover in a few months' time that we have big government deficits, that we have high levels of unemployment, because every company now discovers that they can also be 10, 15, 20% more efficient. You see all the big announcements of layoffs in some of the industries like tourism and travel. So we will come to a point in a few months' time that the unemployment levels are high and governments don't have money. And then you come to James' point, where are we going to spend the money? And this is where the governments need to have courage. They need to say, we did 10 trillion, but we're going to do another 10 trillion. And there, it's not a matter of, and certainly make it conditional. What governments will do, they will be probably more lenient towards some of the industries that create jobs right away. And I can understand that to some extent. So they've been reluctant in airlines to put conditions on there. But you look at the European government and van der Leyen and the European Green Deal, the French government, they are clearly saying already now, we want it to be conditional. And where we see businesses lobbying for the opposite, we've seen the car industries lobbying, we've seen the airlines industry lobbying, we've seen some other industries like the fossil fuel elements lobbying for leaner environmental laws. I think a big majority of businesses have actually stepped up and say, wait a minute, this is not about reversing a trend, this is about accelerating a trend. The discussion of going back to something was a too slow a trend, but the trend was happening. What we're now talking about is be smart enough, don't find yourself back 10 years from now in even a bigger crisis, accelerate the trend.
But that's a very positive and optimistic point, and we have quite an optimistic crowd. But I'd like to, in two ways, if you like, Paul, just sort of go after that and kick the tires on whether or not the governments are going to need to be much more interventionist. I mean, the reality is that right now, you know, big business is coming in many forms and saying, look, we need the money right now. And there's not the time to negotiate the small print on things like emissions, on things like social impacts. But once companies have taken that money, there is going to be a different relationship between not just government and business, but between the public and business. And so this is surely a moment that, to Mark's point, government should be saying, look, when you take our money, you should be clear, we are going to take an interest in what happens next.
I could not agree more. And even more so, I would actually go further. You make it conditional on behavior change, not just, you know, American companies, some companies in the US have now discovered that they are not getting any help from the government because they had organized themselves in tax havens. Rightfully so, check. Multi-stakeholder model wins versus shareholder primacy. Some companies have discovered that their trust and image has gone down the drain because they were applying for funds whilst they were paying big bonuses to their CEOs or buying up, doing share buybacks. Check, multi-stakeholder model getting the preference. So we see it moving. And I think collectively, if we speak out as citizens of this world, I'm here not as a retired CEO of Unilever, I'm here as a citizen of this world. So if we collectively speak out and say that is the behavior we're going to reward, and this is the behavior we're not going to accept, I think we can accelerate that move. It is in our hands. Just like we collectively are attacking the COVID crisis, we can also collectively attack the underlying economic crisis we have. Now, there are some conditions that need to change, including on governments. We need to stop this mindless growth and redefining what really is important to us. When the GDP number, of which we are so fixated, was invented, it was invented in the end of the 30s by a guy called Simon Kuznets. And Simon was an American, and he said, listen, guys, this is just about industrial output. It doesn't matter negative externalities. It doesn't matter measure positive externalities. It doesn't talk about the income distribution. And frankly, it doesn't talk about depletion of natural capital. You should never use this to decide if your economy is doing well or not. It's just a measure of industrial output. Now the world has changed. We've come up against these boundaries. So we need to start changing. We need to put a price on carbon. We need to value these externalities and start moving. Now, why do we need to work all together? Why are we in this with all of us, not just governments, not just business, but also all of us together, is that we need to change the way we produce food in this world. We need to green our economy and get out of fossil fuel. We need to put a better social system in place, including healthcare. These are fundamental system changes at the same time as we need to move the financial market to the longer term. Sure, that is difficult. Sure, that will take effort. But if we miss this opportunity, you're going to explain that to your grandchildren and their children. I don't want to be part of that. I want to give everything possible to at least go as fast as we can. And that is the mindset we should have. The other side, that little voice that says you shouldn't do it, it cannot be done and all that, it leads to nothing. We came from that. We should not forget what we just went through.
So Paul, I want to bring in some people here, because some of them make some either challenging, uncomfortable, frightening points. And I think we should sort of hear all of those in this. One of them, if it's possible, I'd love to bring in a point that I think Meronisa Yusuf made. I don't know whether, Meronisa, you're there, but yeah, there you are. But why don't you make it? There you are.
Actually, so this is my wife's account. Her name is Meronisa, and we're both here. The question is around the rise. There's a New York Fed study that was released today, which links the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic to the rise of the far right in Germany. Germany, which was quite an advanced society for its time, quite a sophisticated society, and yet something like that happened. And they sort of haven't read the study, but I read it today in the FT and in Bloomberg. And I think in the context of the massive public debt that we are piling on, the potential risks around hyperinflation, all of which was experienced in the 1920s, whether linked directly to the pandemic or not, but certainly that is the situation we find ourselves in today. So in the context of a sovereign debt crisis, hyperinflation, public debt, and also the link to, we are talking today about a very noble form of humanitarian socialism. But looking back at history, there is some link back to the rise of the far right instead.
And forgive me, what's your name? What is your name?
Omer.
Omer. By the way, just that's the fact that I've called you by your wife's name remind me of one of my happiest stories of a different time when we used to fly. Do you remember that? I went on a holiday with a friend of mine, Andrew. We flew through Gatwick Airport. When we arrived at the other side, someone said, "Sir, you're traveling on your wife's passport. I'm afraid you're not her." So I'm glad that I know who you are, and Helen Maronisa too. But Paul, how much do you worry about that? Just for what it's worth, we had a discussion this morning where we were thinking about the 1920s comparison, and that it's really possible that we come out of this into a world in which, wealthy people, if you like, the sort of executive class actually comes out, and even more so than 2008-9, does quite well because they have assets and access to assets, and the rest of people see their lives, derailed. How much do you take on those points?
Oh, that is a tremendous worry. I think that is one of the main things why I started Imagine with some of my colleagues, Valerie Keller, Jeff Seabright, and others. It's one of my main worries. I've always said that an economic system where too many people feel they're not participating or are excluded from will ultimately rebel against itself. And we see that happening all over the world, and we're blind to that. Yeah. And that is, to me, is the bigger worry, that many of the things the governments now do, and there are some indicators of that in the US rescue package more so than Europe. In Europe, it trickles more down to individuals. In the US, it is more tax-based and trickles down to companies and higher net worth individuals, that it actually accentuates the difference that we have seen in income levels. In fact, it certainly happened in the 2007-2008 financial crisis. That's where a lot of the billionaires were born, to the extent that you now have 2,150 of them that earn the same money as 60% of the poorest in this world. It's totally unacceptable. So if we don't create a system that is more inclusive, it is not going to work anymore. And people finally have understood it. If social media has helped them with something, it made them aware of it. In the past, they were dumb. Now coming back, because of lack of knowledge, not because of being dumb themselves. Now coming back to the First World War and the issues there, I think it is a little bit oversimplistic to link it to the Spanish flu. I mean, everybody can make correlations if you want to. And I also am not worried this time around, for different reasons that we can discuss separately, that we get hyperinflation. But it was a world that went back into their own nationalism. Multilateralism was killed then. That's one of the reasons we started the International Chamber of Commerce, which I'm currently the chair of. The people there were called merchants of peace, because the whole idea, and it started exactly 100 years ago, was if countries are more interdependent, we have less chances of wars. We have more and better opportunities to develop wealth, provided we take care of everybody. And I think that's a lesson that we have forgotten in the financial crisis, and we should not forget now. And it's very important, another reason of how you then spend the money.
I just want to bring in Lisa G, if I can, for a moment, because one of the questions about this, and particularly in the shadow of the financial crisis, is the extent to which people who are themselves executive leaders have public confidence. And Lisa, I saw you make a point about CEOs sort of prescribing the future.
Yeah, it's not so much CEOs. I mean, it's the combination of CEOs and politicians. It's kind of everybody who has done well out of the current, sorry, I've got my, everyone who's done well out of the current system, and everyone who's winning in the current game. Are they the best people to introduce a new game, to change the game? What's the incentive for people who are already doing really well?
None.
Yeah,
That's the problem. I agree with you 100%. The
nothing.
vested order is the most dangerous one because they will be pushing back against any systems change. So to really change, you have to get the forces to come from outside the system itself if you want the magnitude of change that we're currently looking for.
So on that note, Jeff, I'm sorry, we've got derailed into saving the world, and actually we said we were going to try and figure out whether there are going to be some innovative changes that you're seeing kind of business by business. And I wondered whether or not, you know, not exactly giving us sort of top tips, but, you know, what are you seeing in terms of companies that are coming to Seedrs that are saying, look, we think that we've got a new idea. What sectors are they in? What ideas are exciting you? And how does it relate to the agenda that Paul's talking about?
Well, I think first of all, I mean, as I say, you know, significantly before this crisis and probably independent of it, you know, the rise in sustainability businesses, and I think in particular, you know, businesses that are trying to produce things, build things, deliver things that we have long had, but doing so in a greener and more environmentally friendly way has been a huge theme across our platform for the last few years, and I would expect that to continue regardless of and possibly enhanced by the crisis. But I also think that there's going to be a lot that comes out of these coming months that I haven't thought of and that we aren't seeing yet. I mean, I think to this question about will we all go back to the norm, or will we you know, and just try to protect what we had versus will we see innovation? I mean, I think the answer is both on slightly different timescales. Of course, on 3 months, 6 months, 9 months timing, everyone's focus is going to be to ensure employment, get companies back to work, get jobs in. And I don't, you know, I think there will be some creative and clever opportunities even then, but that's not the exciting time frame. What's exciting is as we move out of it, a lot of orthodoxies will have been challenged. A lot of problems will have been created. Entrepreneurs love problems. That is the backbone of the innovative economy, is when a problem comes up and a clever person tries to find a solution to it. So, you know, if I had my crystal ball, I would probably be a far wealthier man than I am. I think instead, what I can say with some confidence is that this is very much falls into the Rumsfeldian known unknowns. You know, we don't know what is going to be the brilliant stuff that comes out of this crisis, but Lord knows there's going to be a lot.
Can you tell us though what companies and innovative companies are knocking on your door now and saying, we're looking for money, we've got a new idea?
Well, I'll give a couple examples of businesses that we've seen recently. You know, one you know, a favorite to talk about these days is a business called the Cheeky Panda, which makes sustainable toilet paper, kitchen roll, and other disposable paper products using bamboo. Now, again, this was a business that was pre-crisis. This was a business that was already trying to solve one of the many issues of waste and you know, deliver a greener solution to household products that were, you know, very much needed. But suddenly, given the shortages that we've seen of certain products at the moment, I think they've become very much in the spotlight. You know, we have another fantastic business, you know, called Ripple Energy, which is doing, you know, which is taking an innovative approach to wind farms. And one of the things that we see across so many of these businesses is it's not necessarily some deeply technical solution that no one has ever thought of or ever understood. It's about taking models that are known, are understood, but executing them better, executing them more quickly, executing them on less capital than previous people have done. And as I say, we're seeing that across so many of the sustainable, you know, sustainable economy sectors.
And just one thing, there's innovation is really great. It sounds wonderful. Obviously, for it to work, you have got to, as you say, Jeff, have execution, and you have to have resources. And does that mean that, I'm really struck by what Paul said earlier, that paradigm changes rarely happen when there is an emergency, that you're unlikely to have the funding resources to do really new things in the next year or two in terms of the startup world, in terms of the new ideas in business?
No, I don't think so, actually. I mean, I think there is a lot of capital out there for the right ideas. I think this is, you know, a difficult time, perhaps, to be going out and raising a significant amount of capital. But I saw somebody on the chat made the point that, even if the times we're in are slightly more capital poor, they're more time rich, that there are a lot of people who either furloughed or working less or whatever it may be, are sitting in their studies and bedrooms thinking up new ideas. Innovation long before it requires a significant amount of capital, often just requires a few people sitting in front of a computer, thinking through ideas, doing their research, doing their legwork. And I think that now is probably an ideal time for the sort of germs of those ideas, pardon the pun in a pandemic, but for the initial thoughts around how you build a new great innovation. That's what's going to start to emerge. And then as we come out, as there becomes more capital available, those are the ideas that are going to be funded. We saw that so very clearly in 2008, 2009. I mean, I think Seedrs is one of a whole number of businesses that emerged out of that crisis. And we did exactly what I'm describing here. We weren't raising money. We were sitting, thinking up the idea, as the markets fell apart in 08, 09, along with so many of our peer firms. And then as the opportunities came to actually commercialize it and there was money behind it, we launched into the market. So I think we're going to see a lot of innovation coming even in these months, but perhaps it happens in a slightly more below the radar way. And then all of a sudden in 2021, 2022, when you see this whole wave of fantastic, innovative new businesses on the scene, and people start wondering, where did that come from? Where were these people? Well, they were the ones who were stuck at home in 2020.
Paul, can I ask you about that? And I'm going to sort of put it to you, if I might, in a slightly clumsy way. I have a very sweet tooth. I am endlessly excited by innovations in chocolate bars. Now this one's got a raisin, it's got a nut, it's got a piece of biscuit, they mix it around, and I'm endlessly struck by the range of innovation. It strikes me that when you look at product innovation, it tends to happen when economies are buoyant, right? When consumers have enough money to experiment and companies themselves have the resources to experiment. And so I wonder, when you think about, going back to the sort of question at the start, innovation in the private sector, whether or not you really think that's going to be delayed for the next year or two because companies are going to be so focused on cost control and quite defensive that exactly the moment for the changes that you're talking about is going to be prevented by the state of the economy.
Undoubtedly, you can point to some companies that might react that way, because what we saw in the 2007-2008 crisis, which is fairly fresh, and I just became CEO at the end of that, we saw some companies going into the mode of cutting costs and hunkering down, and that often goes at the expense of innovations. And R&D, research and development, is an easy one to cut for many companies because the effects are 4 or 5 years from now. So we saw some of that, and undoubtedly we see some of that here again as well. I think a worse thing happening is that many companies will look at ways to be more efficient because of the crisis, and actually are going to run their businesses with less people. Innovations itself, the businesses that do well, will actually be the ones that innovate, because they will differentiate themselves from the rest that they compete with. At Unilever, I doubled my R&D spending when I became CEO. I built new factories. I increased my brand spending behind that. And we got a 300% shareholder return over the 10 years. And we grew twice as fast as our competitors. So we took a different tact that served us well. Society is showing a lot of cracks. Consumers have a lot of angst. There's a lot of need out there for products that respond to what they're looking for. Mm-hmm. As Jeff is saying, rightfully so, more environmentally friendly, like his toilet paper example. Companies that understand that respond to these needs, which ultimately is innovation, will be doing very well. So it would be a misnomer to think that we are going to see a starving of innovation. I think the companies that are going to survive will be the ones that invest in innovation. Now,
can I just ask you one thing about that, just because we've got a few moments left? And one of the things, Paul, that's come up a lot, my co-founder, Katie Vanek-Smith, was just talking about having had her first virtual GP appointment. And so the read across of innovation that comes from tech or comes from the private sector, but into public policy. With your sort of imagine hat on, thinking about chambers of commerce, actually practically, one of the things that's worrying, I think, at this moment is that innovation may not travel easily across into public policy when it's most needed. How do you make that happen?
So what we think, at least, there are many ways that you can make that happen, but one of the important things that we work on is to say that there are enough signals from the marketplace that we want to go to sustainable sourcing, that we need to stop issues like deforestation, that we need increasingly a price on carbon. We have more companies that have an internal price on carbon than governments. So our premise right now is that if we get enough critical mass of the private sector together, we can actually move things forward faster. We are now convening some of the leaders in the food sector to see if we can accelerate the food sector, where the farmer has always paid the price, never covered all the risks, but never got paid for anything, and that's why he stayed poor. Can we actually change that together? And can we do that with a critical mass of companies to also give governments the courage to take changes? The same we're doing in the fashion industry. I talked about the regenerative cotton, or agriculture now causes about 25 to 30% of climate change. It is totally bizarre, because you think that if we grow things for people in the world, it could be actually sequestering carbon. It should actually be carbon positive, not carbon negative. On top of that, we waste 30 to 40% of the food we produce. Totally bizarre. And that's an issue that can only be solved if we all work together, because there's a behavior in there, there's a consumer pressure in there, there's government regulation in there. And it's only when you put them all together and behave like adults and put the problem out there to be solved versus our own egos to be stroked, that we can find these solutions. And that is the real premise of why we created Invention. And what we have currently seen with the fashion industry that we've worked on and the food and agriculture industry that we are now working on, that you can make significant progress in a short period of time if you put enough of the people together that share that common purpose and that common vision of a better world for everybody. And I challenge people when they say, and it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be a straight line. It never will. A smooth you cannot climb a smooth mountain. Sometimes you need to rest. Sometimes you need to go down a little bit to acclimatize, and this journey will be the same. But I challenge anybody if there is a better journey, because if there is a better journey, we should walk it. If there isn't, we should put all of our energy behind this to make this happen and say that we were part of it. Failure here is not an option anymore. I hope that's one of the things that we have learned, that you cannot have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. And I think that's the bottom line of the COVID crisis, James.
Okay, well, that is a very good place to stop. Actually, this is one of those things where, even though I think, like many people, I spent much too long in front of a screen today, I'd actually rather like to keep going. But we try to keep these things to time, because you'd like to spend some time looking at each of these things in detail. I hope, though, that we've come away with some things that we can think about and latch onto. For what it's worth, a ThinkIn, if you've not been to one before, works like this. You try and hear lots and lots of points, and at the end, the editor, me or one of my fellow editors, tries to pull together what will propel our journalism, what we should look into, and how our thinking's been informed by the conversation. So in that sense, actually, I'm going to come away and say, I was rather inspired by one simple thing as Paul and Jeff and Lisa and Anita and others were talking. One of our members, Ed Dowding, just wrote a really wonderful little note where he said, in effect, you could have what looked to me like something that we could call realistic idealism, that idealism is your North Star and realism is your means of delivery. And I rather like that point. In that spirit, I sort of divided what I kind of took away. One was that I think, it is a significant thing. I take Lisa's point about the people who succeeded in the world then sort of prescribing what happens next. But the fact that you've got someone like Paul that calls out the injustice of that system and the fact that it radically needs to be changed is I think, a powerful thing. And specifically by simplifying it around things that are sort of urgent, the climate issue and the inequality issue. Not that there aren't many others, but those two. And I think that it picks up on the point that Omer made, around let's think about the really profound risks that come with inequality, take us back to the 20s and address that. I'm also really struck by the fact that the breakdown in the way in which globalization works gets us to this place. And so it's not about less globalization, but a globalization that is fair and safe. And then you get to the delivery, the realism end of it. I am really struck, you know, like many of us, Jeff, we're going to be thinking about cheeky panda long after we really want to. But the idea of innovation in business, I do think it's difficult. I think that the point that Paul made about change rarely coming in an emergency is one that we really need to think about. But the fact that, you know, Mark made this point about how do you attach conditions so that you use this crisis to make structural changes, you know, within the system. I was really struck by the fact that in the end, people are, to David Rose's point, drawn back to an incrementalism, but let's make sure that it does actually deliver some things. For that, I think the critical thing is, what do we measure, you know? And Paul, your description of what GDP was originally for and what it's now become for is something that I'm going to think about. And I think that for us at Tortoise, actually trying to think about how you measure outcomes beyond just the financial ones is a proper piece of work. It's led by Alexandra Musavizadeh and the team that does our indexes, but that feels to me like a central piece of work. And I suppose I'll finish the evening with the idea that healthy people can only live on a healthy planet. Those words will ring in my ears. Thank you, everyone, for joining this evening. I know that this lockdown has gone on for a little while now, so we appreciate that. Weirdly, the more time we have, the more time we actually, less time we're actually seeing that we have. So making an hour for all of us this evening is much appreciated. But a particular thank you to you, Jeff Lynn, and of course to Paul Polman. Paul, had you come to our newsroom, we wouldn't have treated you to much more than a round of applause. We can't even do that now. So we're just going to all wave a happy thank you and say it was great listening to you. Thank you very much.